Salams and welcome. This is an interesting video that I came across from a nice website called AB African Biographics, and please support them. They've done a wonderful documentary on the history of Indians in South Africa, and this is mainly for the Gen Z. And many of the Gen Z don't know that the Indians in South Africa, many of them came as slaves or as indentured labor, and they went through a very, very difficult time in South Africa itself from the 1800s and some even before that. Some historians show that the Indians were here for about 400 or 500 years, but many of them came from the 1800s onwards. And I found this very interesting because my father came from India, my grandparents came from India as well. They came as traders or merchants. So there were two main categories of Indians that came to South Africa. One were the indentured laborers who worked on the sugarcane farms, and others were those who came as traders. But the traders found it very difficult because they came in a system of apartheid where they were not allowed to open shops and businesses and so on. But let's look at this documentary, very, very good documentary. Please support this fellow. His name is from African Biographics, AB. So please support him. Let's
On
take a look at
November
it.
16, 1860, a ship carrying 342 indentured Indians arrived in South Africa, marking the beginning of a long and painful period in the history of the Indian diaspora in the region. Between November 1860 and 1911, when the system of indentured labor was stopped, nearly 152,000 indentured laborers from across India arrived in Natal, South Africa. Today, South Africa is home to the largest population of people of Indian descent on the African continent, approximately 1.5 million people, the majority of whom are the descendants of indentured workers brought to the then colony of
I just like to pause there. If you can see these Indians who are working and carrying these heavy timber on the sugarcane farms, one of the difficulties that the Indians faced was that they were promised a 5-year contract, and part of that 5-year contract, they were supposed to give them land in exchange by the British government. And as you remember, in those times, South Africa was under British occupation, and India was also under British occupation. But there was deception. The Indians, when they came here on the 5-year contract, they worked for their food and very little money at the end of the month, and the British government did not honor the contract. The Indians did not get land when they finished their 5-year contract. Furthermore, the conditions were so harsh and hostile. They were basically living in prison camps, and if they did any mistake, then the contract was extended to 10 years, and they had no money to go back on a ship and go back to their place of origin as well. And you can see that many of them are very thin. And as you know, many Indians are generally obese or fat or have diabetes or heart problems. But here, many of them are very, very skinny because they could not even have enough to eat. And one of the very difficult situations they had was that all the men had to work on the farms, but the women also had to work. And any child who reached the age of 5 years, listen to this, 5 years old, had to come work on the farm with their parents. And that is why some of the Indians decided to have many children, because the mothers, as they were pregnant, then they could stay at home. But as soon as the child became 5 years old, they then were forced to take the child. The child could not go to school. The child was then forced to go work on the farm next to the father. So it was very, very difficult conditions. They were living in basically as slaves. So the word indentured laborer does not give the harsh reality of what these people were faced with.
Natal between 1860 and 1911 to develop the sugar industry in this province. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at this system of indentured labor and the story of Indian South Africans. In 1843, Britain officially annexed Natal, South Africa. In 1856, Natal became a full crown colony. At around that time, the colony, caught up in throes of worldwide recession, was on the brink of financial ruin, economic collapse, and bankruptcy. The province was poor and undeveloped, so every effort was made to attract European settlers to the region. New agricultural ventures were implemented. On 30 January 1852, after numerous trials, Edmund Morwood succeeded in perfecting the production of sugarcane on his farm in Natal. This success story brought more white colonizers into the country. As a result, the demand for labor for Natal's sugarcane fields increased dramatically. The Zulus, who were the indigenous people of this region, shunned the agricultural work. For them, the work was women's work and they could not identify with the wage market. They were also not.
You see that when the British tried to get the Zulus in Natal to do the farm work, they refused because they said the farm work is a woman's job. And that's when the British then decided to get slave labor from India to then work on the farms in Natal on the sugar canes.
But amenable
Many of these Indians also worked in the coal mines as well, in the mines deep down as well.
to contract employment. They were pastoralists and showed little interest in becoming wage earners. The solution to the labor shortage was arranged between the British government and the government of India. Keep in mind that during this period, the subcontinent of India was part of the British Empire. So with this arrangement, the Natal colony was permitted to import indentured labor, a practice that dated to the early 1800s in other parts of Africa, such as the island of Mauritius. The system of indenture was created mainly in response to the labor crisis experienced in sugar-producing areas after the abolition of slavery. The scourge of the slave trade came to an end within the British Empire in 1833 when England abolished it. Slaves throughout the British Empire were set free, and this heralded the end of free labor. Here's a brief explanation of what the indentured system entails. Indenture is a type of debt servitude, but it is different from slavery. Under the various terms and conditions of indentureship, workers are to receive food and a small monthly stipend in return for their labor. In the case of Indian indentured laborers, they were promised crown lands and citizenship at the end of 5 years, but unfortunately for them, this promise wasn't entirely honored. During this time, many parts of India were struck by severe famines and epidemics. Life was a continuous struggle for the people of India. So when the recruiters called at the villages, the people grabbed this opportunity to go to South Africa. New recruits were promised land, wealth, and better prospects in Natal. Thousands of people left their villages in droves to seek a better future in Natal. But given the high levels of illiteracy, few workers understood the terms of the contracts that they put their thumb imprint to. Many were commonly misled about where they were departing for and the wages that they would receive. Some of the workers were recruited from rural India to work in cities like Calcutta, but once they were there, they were tricked or persuaded to sign the contract, which took them to the immigration depot and to the plantations overseas. In other cases, they were lied to about the length of the journey. Over two-thirds of the Indians came from southern India, with the rest coming from northern India. The immigrants were for the most part from rural areas and were mainly low-caste Hindus from Madras, and about one-third were women. The ship SS Truro departed from Madras on October 12, 1860 with 342 passengers aboard and arrived in Durban on November 16 the same year, and was the first ship to bring Indian indentured laborers to Natal from India. The SS Belvedere departed from Calcutta on October 4, 1860 with 310 passengers aboard and arrived in Durban on November 26, 1860. Traveling conditions were relatively arduous and uncomfortable. Owing to the cramped conditions, congested traveling conditions, and lack of proper sanitation, disease spread with ease and the mortality rate was high. Although the ship SS Truro escaped mortality, records show that during 1860 to 1866 there were 180 deaths on the ships. In 1 year between 1881 and 1882, there were reportedly 67 deaths. Upon arrival in Natal, the passengers were herded into what was described as unfinished barracks surrounded by pools of stagnant water.
This is an important point. When the Indians came into Durban, instead of having the freedom, they were immediately put in barracks like military camps, and they could not escape from there. So they were faced with harsh conditions, and these were not the promises that they were given. They could not escape these barracks. The conditions were terrible. There were sewage problems. There was mosquitoes there. There was a water plagues. There was swamps around this whole area. So what they were promised and what they got was very, very different, and they could not return back home as well. So basically, they were slaves. They were prisoners without having done a crime.
They were expected to find their own place to relieve and wash themselves in a wild, soggy, mosquito-infested, swampy area. The immigrants remained under guard in the barracks until the planters came to claim their commodities. Employers wanted good, strong, healthy men who would be able to dig, plow, and perform back-breaking work and turn virgin soil in a subtropical area into productive arable land. Women and children were seen as dead stock. Their tasks entailed tilling the soil, planting, fertilizing, weeding, harvesting, loading, transporting, milling, packaging, leveling roads, as well as building dams, factories, and houses, and carrying out repairs and so forth. The conditions at work were harsh, with long working hours and low wages. Given the weak physical condition of the laborers after the long voyage, this work took its toll. Children were expected to work alongside their parents from the time they were 5 years old. If you woke up late, that is later than 3 a.m., you got whipped. No matter what happened, whether there was rain or thunder, you had to work.
That is very difficult. It means you had to start work at 3 o'clock in the morning. And if you were not awake by 3 o'clock in the morning to start work on the farm, then you were whipped and you were punished for not waking up early in the morning at 3 o'clock.
The Indian indentured laborers worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, and reports of rations and wages being withheld were common. Many workers tried to escape their harsh life but were recaptured and imprisoned. Sometimes their initial 5-year contract was doubled to 10 years for attempting to flee. In the 1870s, a new class of immigrants arrived. These were called passenger Indians, and these were Indians who had paid their own way to come to.
The passenger Indians is part of what we know now today as the traders. My father and grandfather were part of these group of Indians who came afterwards. They came with their own money. They were investors. They were traders. Many of them were wealthy people, business people. They were professionals. They were doctors, lawyers. They were accountants. They were nurses and teachers. And many of them came looking for a new horizon. But what they did not realize or they did not know about was the system of apartheid. So when my grandfather and my father, and when they came to South Africa, although they had money to open up a shop, they were not allowed to open up a shop. And up to today, I remember I grew up in Struven Street in Pretoria, and my father's shop, my grandfather's shop today, and that spot where my father's shop is today, the Reserve Bank of South Africa is standing on that spot. And we were kicked out of Pretoria because we were Indians and were sent to a place at Mooiplaas, and we were given no recompensation for the land. We were just kicked out of a house, kicked out of a shop, kicked out of everything because the white businesses felt threatened because the Indians were hardworking, their prices were much better, and the whites could not compete. That was the first problem. Secondly, if an Indian wanted to open up a shop, he could not open under his own name. He needed what is known as a nominee. A nominee is a white Afrikaner man who pretends that he is the owner of the business, and for his signature that he is the so-called owner of the business, my father and grandfather, and this is for all the Indians had to pay these white Afrikaners a monthly rent, like a fee, just to pretend that they are the owners. So when the police used to come regularly checking up myself and our family, our children, and my mother used to all run at the back to hide in the storeroom. And when the police used to come, my father used to just say, no, he is a worker there, he's an employee, and the boss is a Van der Merwe who's working on the farm. And in that way, they avoided being sent to prison. So these were the owners and entrepreneurs. But because of apartheid, they were not allowed to own property in certain areas of the city itself.
South Africa. They were mostly from Gujarati and were traders and mostly Muslim. They began to set up businesses in Natal, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, and to compete with white shopkeepers who felt threatened by the competition. In Natal, the number of Indians had surpassed the number of whites by the 1890s, and the dangers posed by the Indian vote became a rallying point for white people. The white settlers started to feel threatened by a settled Indian population and passed legislation to curb their immigration, trading, employment, and residence rights. In 1891, a law known as Act No. 25 was passed, and it withdrew the promise of land and citizenship to the indentured laborers. Only 51 Indians received crown land from the colony. Anti-Indian legislation had intensified as South Africa became increasingly segregated, and the act was to discourage permanent Indian settlement in the country. By 1888, Indians had to carry passes and could not own land, vote, or live outside of their designated areas. While thousands of laborers toiled on the sugar plantations, it was the British sugar barons who made big money from this bittersweet enterprise. By 1910, nearly 30% of the indentured laborers returned to India, but most chose to stay and thus constituted the forebearers of the majority of present-day South African Indians. Some re-indentured and some leased or bought small plots of land which they cultivated. The struggle of Indians against racist legislation was spearheaded by Mohandas Gandhi, also known as Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi, who came to Durban in 1893, opposed discrimination against Indians. In Natal, he organized protests against obligatory registration, which seriously restricted the freedom to move of all Asians and was partly successful. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian freedom movement, saw firsthand the plight of Asian indentured laborers in South Africa and campaigned on this issue during the first decade of the 20th century. By 1911, India had prohibited its citizens from coming to Natal because of ill treatment. The system of indentured labor was officially abolished by the British government in 1917. During apartheid in South Africa, the Indians were discriminated against by the apartheid legislation, such as the Group Areas Act, which was applied in 1950. Indians were forcibly moved into Indian townships, such as Chatsworth and Phoenix, and had their movements restricted. They were also, as a matter of state policy, given an inferior education compared to white South Africans. In 1961, Indians were officially recognized as a permanent part of the South African population. Many Indians went and played an important role in the struggle against apartheid. The small Indian, colored and white progressive sectors joined with progressive African activists, and together they conducted a common non-racial struggle for freedom and equality. As I mentioned earlier, between November 1860 and 1911, nearly 152,000 indentured laborers from across India arrived in Natal, South Africa. From this painful story, today South Africa is home to the largest population of people of Indian descent on the African continent, and South Africa is well and truly home for them.
It's a very good documentary. The reason why I like it is that it is very objective and well presented. So please support African biographies. And just in very simple terms, this shows the background of the Indians in South Africa. But there are three qualities that Indians have which made them successful in today's South Africa. And those are the three qualities known as the H3: hardworking, honesty, and humility. And that is also personified in the Mandela spirit. The Mandela spirit is also H3, which is hardworking, honesty, and humility. And this is for the Gen Z, that no matter what difficulties you get in life, no matter what gens, whether you're white, Indian, black or colored, or Malay, or Chinese, or Japanese, or Russian, American, we are all South Africans, and this is a beautiful land, and we can show the rest of the world that we are fabulous people, we are beautiful people, and we want to make a difference in making this country a beautiful place for all its citizens. Now, Asians itself, Asians are made up of two main categories, Indians and the Chinese. And traditionally, the Indians and the Chinese are known as super intelligent and very hardworking. And that is why they are so popular in America. Silicon Valley is filled with Chinese and with Indians. But the Asians themselves are made up of two main categories, the Indians and the Chinese. The Indians themselves are made up of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And the Chinese in general is the Far East, which includes China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And people from these areas are traditionally known to be super intelligent, very hardworking. So if you have an Indian in your country, or if you have an Indian in your shop or in your business, or you have an Indian in parliament, then remember you have got an asset to your organization, because Indians are generally hardworking, honest, and humble, and look after them. And Indians have regarded Africa as their homeland. So Indians regard themselves as Africans, and they also learn from one another. And for myself, I also have learned from my professor who was an Afrikaner, and the Afrikaner values and the Muslim values or the Indian values are very, very similar. And my professor taught me a very important lesson. One day we were busy with an operation in theater, and it was very difficult. And he found a solution. It took 3-4 hours extra, but we found a solution. He said a boer maak 'n plan. So I'm proud to call myself an Indian boer. The Indians also maak 'n plan. So I am an Indian boer, and the Indians, the Afrikaners, the Africans, the blacks, the Malays, the colors, we all must work together to make South Africa a beautiful place, because we are all beautiful people. And this is for the Gen Z. Let's show the rest of the world that we can live together in harmony, irrespective of what your religion is, irrespective of what your race is. We are all beautiful people, and let's make South Africa a wonderful and fabulous place for all its citizens. Stay well, look after yourself. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.